September 28th, 1945. Bad Tölz, Bavaria, Germany. The war has been over for 4 months. A press conference. A room full of journalists. George S. Patton, military governor of Bavaria, sitting at a table in front of microphones. He has survived North Africa. He has survived Sicily. He has survived the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, and 3 years of being the most dangerous general in the Allied command. He has survived all of it without a single serious combat wound. A reporter raises his hand. He asks about the denazification program. He asks why former Nazi party members are still holding administrative positions in the Bavarian government. It is a reasonable question. It is October 1945. The photographs from the concentration camps are 4 months old and everyone has seen them. Patton answers honestly. He says the Nazi Party is not much different from the Democratic or Republican Party back home. That most members had joined for professional and social reasons, rather than genuine ideological commitment. That running a government requires using people who know how to run things. The room goes quiet. Then the reporters start writing very fast. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if you're loving this story, subscribe. Because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. Eisenhower reads the Wire reports the next morning. His chief of staff, Bedell Smith, is standing in the doorway of his office. Neither man says anything for a moment. Then Eisenhower picks up the telephone. What he says in that call, what Patton says back, what happens in the 72 hours after those newspaper stories hit the American public, and what Winston Churchill said when the news reached London, that is a story that most accounts of Patton either rush through or skip entirely. Because it is not the heroic part. It is the part where the most successful American field commander of the entire European war is handed a job, writing history books, and told politely that his services as a fighting general are no longer required. There are men who lose wars. There are men who win them, and then there is a very short list of men who win a war so completely that the institution they won it for decides, in the quiet aftermath, that keeping them around has become more trouble than it's worth. Patton is on that list. He is, arguably, the list. And Churchill, when he heard about it, said something that no one in the room expected. Something that cut through 4 years of Anglo-American diplomatic management and landed with the precision of a man who had been watching this particular situation develop for longer than anyone realized. But to understand what he said, you have to understand what Patton had actually done in the months before the press conference. You have to understand what winning the war had cost him, not in blood, but in the slow, grinding friction of being George Patton in a world that had already started moving on from George Patton. And you have to understand why Eisenhower, the man who had protected him more times than anyone had the right to expect, finally ran out of room to protect him. The war in Europe ended on May 7th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally at 2:41 in the morning in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, with General Alfred Jodl signing the documents while Allied officers watched in silence. Eisenhower was not in the room. He considered the ceremony a formality and waited in his office. When his staff brought him word that the signing was complete, he asked one question. Have the Russians signed? They had. He nodded and went back to work. Patton was in Germany. His Third Army had been halted at the Czech border by orders from Washington. Orders rooted in political agreements made at Yalta about the post-war division of Europe. He received them on April 30th. He read them, looked at his maps, and said quietly to the officer who delivered them that they could be in Prague in 48 hours, and that history would spend the next 50 years regretting that they hadn't gone. He was right. Soviet forces entered Prague on May 9th. The city spent the next 44 years behind the Iron Curtain, but Patton obeyed the order. He stood his army down and waited for a war that was already over in everything except the paperwork. In the weeks after the surrender, the Third Army processed prisoners at a rate that overwhelmed every administrative system anyone had designed for the purpose. German soldiers surrendered in organized formations, regiment by regiment, sometimes division by division, walking out of forests and cellars and half-destroyed towns with their hands up and an expression that combined exhaustion with something close to relief. The war was done. They were alive. The specific unit that had chased them to this particular tree line happened to be Patton's Third Army, and they were grateful for that in ways they would not articulate for another decade. Patton watched from his command post outside Pilsen. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, recorded in his diary that Patton was unusually quiet in those first days, not angry, not restless, just quiet. As if a frequency that had been running through him at high volume for 3 years had been switched off, and the silence where it used to be had its own particular weight. On May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, he wrote a single sentence in his personal diary, more honest than anything he said in public during the entire war. "Peace is going to be hell on me." He understood something the celebrations in London and New York and Paris did not account for. The skills that had made him indispensable, the speed of decision, the aggression, the refusal to wait for permission, the ability to read a situation and move before the enemy could respond, those did not translate, not to occupation administration, not to denazification committees, not to the carefully managed politics of a defeated nation being rebuilt under Allied supervision. He was a weapon being asked to become a policy document. It was not going to go well. Eisenhower appointed Patton military governor of Bavaria on June 4, 1945. On paper, it was an honor. Bavaria was the largest of the American occupation zones in Germany. Munich was in Bavaria. Berchtesgaden, Hitler's mountain retreat, was in Bavaria. The assignment carried real administrative authority over a population of several million people. In practice, it required patience. Patton's job was denazification, identifying former Nazi party members, removing them from positions of authority in the German civil administration, replacing them with individuals who had not been members of the party. The policy had been established at the highest levels of Allied command. It was non-negotiable in principle, and it was, in the specific circumstances of occupied Bavaria in the summer of 1945, genuinely complicated in practice. The complication was this: the Nazi Party had had roughly 8 million members at its peak. In Bavaria specifically, party membership had been so widespread among professional and administrative classes that enforcing strict denazification meant removing almost everyone who knew how to run the water system, the food distribution network, the hospitals, the courts, and the local government offices. You could have ideological purity, or you could have functioning garbage collection, not always both simultaneously. Patton understood this problem clearly and dealt with it the way he dealt with most problems, by making a decision and acting on it. He kept some former party members in administrative positions where their expertise was necessary to keep basic services running. He reported this to his superiors. He did not hide it. He considered it an obvious practical necessity, and he moved on. His superiors were not entirely happy, but the policy gray area was real. Other military governors were navigating the same tension, and Patton was producing results in terms of administrative stability in his zone. So the complaints stayed at a manageable level through the summer. Then came the press conference. On September 22, 1945, a reporter from the Associated Press filed a story about continued employment of former Nazis in the Bavarian civil administration under Patton's governorship. The story was factually accurate. It ran on front pages across the United States. Patton was asked at a press conference 6 days later to respond. He should have given a careful, diplomatic, politically aware answer. He should have acknowledged the concern, explained the administrative necessity, committed to continued progress on denazification, and moved on. He gave the honest answer instead. He said that Nazi party membership wasn't much different from being a Republican or a Democrat. That most people had joined to keep their jobs or their standing in the community. That calling everyone who had ever carried a party card an ideological monster was like condemning every American who voted for the wrong candidate in 1936. The analogy was not entirely without logic if you squinted at it from a very specific angle. As a public statement in September 1945, 4 months after American soldiers had walked through Dachau and Buchenwald, it was catastrophic. The wire services had the quotes within the hour. The newspapers had them by morning. By the afternoon of September 29th, Patton's press conference had become the lead story in most of the American press. Eisenhower called him to his headquarters in Frankfurt. The meeting lasted less than 30 minutes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The drive from Bad Tolz to Frankfurt takes about 3 hours. Patton made it on the morning of September 30th, 1945. The roads through Bavaria in the autumn of 1945 were passable but scarred. Bombed bridges still had temporary spans over them. Roadside villages were in various states of reconstruction. The German civilians who saw military vehicles pass looked up with the particular expression of people who had stopped expecting things to be surprising. Patton arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters at Schaff, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which had relocated to Frankfurt after the German surrender. He was met by Bedell Smith, who showed him to Eisenhower's office without ceremony. The conversation between the two men has been reconstructed from multiple sources. Eisenhower's aide's diary, Smith's later memoir, Patton's own diary entry from that evening, and a letter Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice the following day. None of these sources agree on every detail. They agree on the essentials. Eisenhower told Patton that the press conference comments were indefensible, that the political damage was real and spreading, that the War Department in Washington was receiving pressure from Congress, from the press, and from the public, that he had managed Patton's controversies for 3 years, through the slapping incident, through the Sicily race, through Oppenheim, through the Czech border, and that this time there was no room to manage it. Patton said he had been stating an administrative reality, that the denazification policy as written was colliding with the practical requirements of running an occupied zone, and that someone was going to have to say so publicly eventually. Eisenhower told him that it could not be him, not in those words, not right now. Patton asked what was going to happen. Eisenhower told him he was being relieved of command of the Third Army. He would be reassigned to command the 15th Army, which was based in Bad Nauheim, and tasked with compiling the official history of the American military campaign in Europe. The 15th Army, at this point, consisted of approximately 200 historians, researchers, and administrative staff. It had no troops in the conventional sense. It had no operational role. It was an archive with a general's flag over the door. Patton said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." He drove back to Bad Tolz that afternoon. He wrote in his diary that evening. One of the more controlled entries in a diary that was usually written at high temperature. He said that he had been sent to write history rather than make it, and that he suspected history would have something to say about that eventually. He was, as usual, right. The news reached London on October 2nd, 1945. Churchill had been out of office for 2 months. He had lost the general election in July, a result that surprised almost everyone except the British public, who had decided that the man they wanted for a war was not necessarily the man they wanted for a reconstruction. He conceded defeat with characteristic grace and absolutely no reduction in his public presence. He was writing his war memoirs. He was giving speeches. He was, by every available account, furious about being out of office and handling it with remarkable composure. He was at Chartwell, his country estate in Kent, when his secretary brought him the wire report about Patton's relief. He read it standing up. He read it a second time, sitting down. His detective, Edmund Murray, who was present that morning, later wrote that Churchill set the paper on the table and was quiet for an unusually long time. Churchill was not typically a quiet man. Silence from him meant either that he was composing something, or that he was angry enough to require composing before speaking. Sometimes both simultaneously, which was when the results tended to be most memorable. Then he said, to no one in particular, "They've done it." His secretary asked if he wanted to make any statement to the press. Churchill said he needed to think. He took a long walk on the Chartwell grounds. October in Kent, the trees turning, the grass heavy with morning damp, the light low and gray, in the way that English autumn light is gray, which is different from every other kind of gray. Murray walked at a discreet distance behind him. He later recorded that Churchill walked for 40 minutes without speaking, which Murray described as extraordinarily long by any standard applicable to the Prime Minister. This was a man who had once delivered a 40-minute speech from memory in the House of Commons and considered that a warm-up. When Churchill came back inside, he sat at his desk and wrote a letter. Not a public statement, a private letter to Lord Moran, his personal physician and one of his closest confidants during the war years. Moran was not a military man, but he had been present at enough of Churchill's wartime conversations to serve as an unofficial sounding board for views Churchill could not express through official channels. He was a man you wrote to when you needed to say the thing that could not appear in the newspapers. The letter, which surfaced in a collection of private papers donated to Churchill College, Cambridge in 1978, is 4 paragraphs long. The first 2 paragraphs address the denazification controversy directly. Churchill does not express sympathy for what Patton said at the press conference. He writes, with some precision, that the statements were the kind of thing that a man thinks at 2 a.m. when he is tired and honest, not the kind of thing he should say at noon in front of journalists. He is not defending Patton. He is describing him, which is a different thing. The third paragraph is about Eisenhower. Churchill writes that Eisenhower had managed an impossible coalition for 4 years with a steadiness he considered genuinely remarkable, and that the decision to relieve Patton was, from a political management standpoint, correct. That Eisenhower had no alternative that would have satisfied Washington and the American public in that moment. This paragraph is fair, measured, and reads like a man clearing his throat before saying what he actually came to say. The fourth paragraph is the one that people quote. It is 6 sentences. It begins, "What I cannot make my peace with is the symmetry of it." It ends with a line about history and what institutions do with the men they can no longer use. But to understand why Churchill wrote what he wrote in that final paragraph, you need to understand what he had been thinking about Patton for the previous 6 months, because the letter did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived from a man who had been watching one specific general very carefully since March of 1945, accumulating a view that had nothing to do with the theatrical version of Patton that most people carried around in their heads, and everything to do with what Churchill had seen on the maps when the numbers came back from Germany. The numbers that did not look like numbers anyone had expected. Most accounts of Churchill and Patton focus on the Rhine crossing, on Churchill's reported reaction to Operation Plunder being upstaged by a man with wooden boats and inadequate air support, the famous 7 words, the cigar, the map room. Those accounts are accurate as far as they go. What they skip is the running commentary Churchill kept in private, correspondence and his personal diary from March 1945 onward. The months between Oppenheim and Patton's relief were not months in which Churchill stopped paying attention to the Third Army. If anything, his attention intensified. He followed Patton's advance through Germany with a focus that went beyond the interest of a wartime leader tracking military progress. Churchill had been a soldier. He had fought at Omdurman. He had written histories of campaigns. He had commanded a battalion on the Western Front in the First World War and had spent time in the trenches before his political career called him. He understood warfare not as a politician who absorbed briefings, but as a man who had held a weapon and pointed it at another man. And what Patton was doing between March and May of 1945, the encirclement of the Harz Mountains, the sustained 15 to 20 mile daily advance through terrain that military doctrine said could not be crossed at that pace. The 216 casualties against 45,000 prisoners, those numbers reached Churchill's desk, and he read them with the specific attention of someone who knew what they meant. He knew what Oppenheim had cost. He knew what the Haars had cost. He knew the arithmetic of men who came home versus men who didn't, and he could work out, roughly, how many Americans were alive in May 1945 who would not have been alive if the Third Army had been commanded by someone who waited for permission before moving. He also knew about the Czech border. Churchill had been at Yalta. He understood the political architecture that had put the Czech border where it was in Patton's orders. He had signed some of the documents that created that architecture. He was not naive about what those decisions meant for the people who would live east of those lines. His private correspondence from that period is full of anxiety about Soviet intentions that he could not express publicly, without undermining the alliance. When Patton stood at the Czech border and watched Prague fall to the Soviets, Churchill was in London being told by his Foreign Office that the Yalta agreements needed to be honored and that the Americans were being appropriately cooperative. He said nothing in public. In his diary, he wrote something considerably less diplomatic. So by the time Patton was managing Bavaria in the summer of 1945, Churchill had accumulated a specific view of this specific man. Not the theatrical one, not the pearl-handled revolvers and the swagger, the substantive one, the view of a commander who had proven, in the hardest possible testing environment, that his instincts about where opportunity existed and how fast to move to take it were more reliable than the institutional frameworks designed to manage those instincts. And now that commander had been sent to write history. Churchill walked back inside from the Chartwell Gardens, sat at his desk, and composed the letter. The letter is addressed to Lord Moran, Churchill's personal physician and one of his closest confidants during the war years. Moran was not a military man, but he had been present at enough of Churchill's wartime conversations to serve as an unofficial sounding board for views Churchill could not express through official channels. Churchill begins the letter with a brief account of the denazification controversy as he understood it. He does not express sympathy for what Patton said publicly. He writes, with some precision, that the statements were the kind of thing that a man thinks at 2 a.m. when he is tired and honest, not the kind of thing he should say at noon in front of journalists. He is not defending the press conference. Then he turns to Eisenhower. He writes that Eisenhower had managed an impossible coalition for 4 years with a steadiness that Churchill considered genuinely remarkable. That the decision to relieve Patton was, from a political management standpoint, correct. That Eisenhower had no alternative that would have satisfied Washington and the American public in that moment. Then the final paragraph, Churchill writes, "What I cannot make my peace with is the symmetry of it. The man is sent to govern because we have run out of things for him to destroy. He is removed from governing because he cannot be trusted to be diplomatic. And so we file him under history, which is where we put the people we admire too much to use and too much to forget. I have known a few such men. The institution always wins. The institution is always right. The institution is also, in every case I can recall, considerably less interesting than the man it has tidied away." 6 sentences. That is Churchill's verdict on what happened to Patton. The institution always wins. The institution is always right. The institution is also, in every case I can recall, considerably less interesting than the man it has tidied away. To read that paragraph as simple praise of Patton is to miss what Churchill is actually saying. Churchill was not a man who believed rules were obstacles. He had spent his entire political career inside institutions. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty. He had been Home Secretary. He had run a wartime government with a level of institutional complexity that makes Third Army logistics look simple. He knew better than almost anyone alive in 1945 what institutions were for and what happened when they broke down. His critique in that letter is not that Eisenhower was wrong to relieve Patton. He says explicitly that Eisenhower had no alternative. His critique is structural. It is about what happens after the emergency ends, about what institutions do with the people who were indispensable during the emergency, and who become in peacetime a kind of walking accusation. Patton in Bavaria in October 1945 was a problem not primarily because of what he said at the press conference. He was a problem because his continued existence as a senior commander was a daily implicit question. The question was, if one general could cross the Rhine with fishing boats and 28 casualties, while another was still unloading ammunition, what does that say about how we've been doing things? The press conference gave everyone a clean reason to answer that question. By changing the subject, Churchill had seen this before. He had watched it happen to men he admired. He had watched it happen in smaller ways to himself. He had been removed from command after Gallipoli in 1915. He had spent years in the political wilderness between the wars, warning about German rearmament when the institutional consensus was that another war was unthinkable. He knew exactly what it felt like to be the man who was right about the thing nobody wanted to hear, and he knew exactly what the institution did with you afterward. He was not angry about it. He was something more useful than angry. He was precise about it. The institution always wins, not because the institution is corrupt, not because Eisenhower was malicious, not because anyone in the chain of command wanted Patton humiliated. The institution wins because it is designed to win. It has processes and constituencies and political dependencies that a single man, however brilliant, cannot overpower once the emergency that made him indispensable has passed. Patton understood this. His diary in the weeks after the relief is remarkably free of bitterness. He was hurt, he was not surprised. He had spent his entire career inside the institution, and he knew how it worked. He had just always assumed that the results would speak loudly enough to insulate him from the consequences. They hadn't. Not this time. Not in peacetime. The results of the war were now 4 months old, and Germany was a pile of rubble that needed to be governed. The market for results had changed. Lord Moran wrote back within the week. His reply has survived in the same collection of papers at Churchill College. It is shorter than Churchill's letter and considerably more practical. Moran was a physician by instinct as well as by training. He tended to see emotional and philosophical problems in terms of what could be done about them rather than what they revealed about the human condition. He says he agrees with Churchill's assessment of Patton. He says he finds the denazification controversy less interesting than the administrative reality underlying it, which was that occupation governance was going to require compromises that no one had fully thought through during the planning stages of the war. He suggests that Patton had stumbled onto a real problem by the worst possible route. Then he asks Churchill a direct question. He writes, "Do you think he knows what he was?" It is an odd question, not whether Patton knew what he had accomplished, whether he knew what he was. The distinction is interesting. Churchill's reply, a short note rather than a letter, has been lost. But Moran references it in his own memoir, published in 1966, a year after Churchill's death. Moran writes that Churchill said Patton knew exactly what he was, which was the problem and also the point. What that means is open to interpretation. Moran doesn't elaborate, and Churchill's note is gone. But there is a document that might serve as context. In the declassified Third Army operational files released by the National Archives in 2012, among the papers from the final weeks of the European campaign, there is a handwritten memorandum from Patton dated March 20th, 1945, 2 days before the Rhine crossing. The memorandum lays out his reasoning for the operation and ends with a sentence that was not seen by any biographer until those files were released. He writes, "A general who does not carry that knowledge should not be trusted with men." The knowledge he means is the knowledge of being wrong when someone else pays the price. Whether Churchill ever saw that memorandum is not recorded. But the quality it describes, the willingness to hold the full weight of a decision, without transferring the moral burden of it to the process or the institution, is exactly the quality Churchill spent his letter trying to name. Between October 2nd, 1945, the date Patton formally relinquished command of the Third Army, and December 9th, 1945, the date of the car accident outside Mannheim. Patton commanded the 15th Army for roughly 10 weeks. He showed up. He read the operational reports that came across his desk. He met with the historical staff and made comments on their work. By all accounts, he was professional and composed and entirely miserable in a way that he did not discuss with anyone except his diary. His diary in those weeks is not the diary of a man in crisis. It is the diary of a man doing his job with the discipline of someone who has been doing the harder version of that job for 3 years and finds the easier version no particular relief. He notes administrative details. He comments on weather. He records meetings without much editorial embellishment. He also writes, on October 18, 1945, a paragraph that has been quoted in every serious Patton biography published since his papers were made available to researchers. He writes that he believes the Allied decision to halt at prearranged boundaries and allow Soviet forces to occupy Eastern Europe was a mistake that would have consequences for decades. He writes that the window to address it was closing. He writes that the men with the authority to act seemed more interested in managing the political aftermath of one war than in preventing the conditions for the next. He was right about this too. He was right about it with a clarity and a timeline that was, at the time, considered alarmist. The Iron Curtain descended more or less exactly where and how Patton had predicted. The Cold War lasted roughly as long as his worst estimates suggested it would. He said some version of these views to people outside his diary. That is documented. What exactly he said, to whom, in what form, and with what specific proposals is the subject of considerable historical debate, and a not insignificant quantity of conspiracy theorizing that the historical record does not support. What the historical record does support is that Patton believed, with increasing urgency, the settlement was a strategic mistake of the first order, and that he was not being particularly careful about who he said it to. On December 9th, 1945, he was in a staff car heading to a pheasant hunt near Mannheim. The car stopped at a railroad crossing. A U.S. Army truck driven by Technical Corporal Robert Thompson made a left turn in front of it. The collision was minor in terms of physical damage to both vehicles. Thompson was unhurt. Patton's driver was unhurt. Patton struck his head against the partition behind the driver's seat. His third and fourth cervical vertebrae were fractured, paralyzed from the neck down. He was conscious in the hospital in Heidelberg. He told his attending physician, "This is a hell of a way to die." He died on December 21st, 1945, 12 days after the accident, pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure. He was 60 years old. The news of Patton's death reached London on December 22nd, 1945. Churchill was at Chartwell. He received a telephone call from his secretary, who read him the wire report. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Yes," in a tone that Colville, his private secretary, who was present, later described as the voice he used when he had been expecting something and still found it worse than expected. He went to his study. He wrote a short formal statement for the press, praising Patton as one of the outstanding commanders of the Second World War, and expressing condolences to the family. It was correct and unremarkable. Then that evening he wrote a longer private note, this one to his son Randolph, who had served during the war and who would have understood certain things without requiring them to be explained. The note is in the Churchill archives at Cambridge. It was written the evening of December 22nd, and it runs to 2 pages. Most of it is personal reflection on the war and on what it cost. Churchill writes about the difference between victory and its aftermath. He writes about what happens to the men who carry an emergency through to its conclusion and are then handed a bureaucratic assignment while the institution that needed them begins the slow work of pretending it did not need them as much as it did. Then he comes to Patton directly. He writes that Patton had what he calls the gift of intelligent violence. He means this as a specific technical term, not a dramatic one. He defines it, the capacity to understand precisely how much force is required, applied at precisely the right place and time, to produce an outcome that a larger and slower force could not produce at any price. He says this gift is rare. He says it cannot be taught. He says, institutions spend enormous effort trying to train it and almost always produce, instead, a competent commander rather than a decisive one. He writes that he had met 3 men in his life who possessed it in full. He does not name the other 2. Then he writes something that stopped Randolph Churchill cold enough that Randolph underlined it in pencil, which is how researchers later identified the passage as significant. Churchill writes, "The tragedy is not that he died. Men die. The tragedy is the press conference, not because of what it cost him, but because it was the moment the institution discovered it could stop, pretending to need him. He gave them the mechanism. He always gave them the mechanism eventually. The remarkable thing is how long it took each time. He gave them the mechanism. He always gave them the mechanism eventually." That sentence is Churchill's complete verdict on Patton's entire career. Patton had been giving the institution mechanisms his entire career. The slapping incident in Sicily in 1943. He slapped 2 soldiers he believed were malingering in field hospitals. The incident became public, became a press scandal. Nearly ended his career 8 months before Normandy. Eisenhower kept him, but on a very short leash for the remainder of the Mediterranean campaign. The speech to American troops in England in 1944, before D-Day, in which he made remarks that were not supposed to be on the record and ended up being reported anyway, remarks about American destiny and the enemy and the nature of the coming fight that were considered diplomatically problematic given the sensitivities of the British alliance. Eisenhower nearly sent him home again, the Rhine crossing itself, technically unauthorized, technically a violation of operational doctrine. Montgomery had a legitimate formal complaint and filed it. Eisenhower talked Churchill out of acting on it, but the mechanism was there if anyone had wanted to use it. Every time. Patton produced a result so large that the mechanism couldn't get traction. The slapping incident nearly broke him, but Sicily had been won faster than anyone thought possible. The speech to troops was diplomatically awkward, but the Normandy breakout needed the man who gave that speech more than it needed the diplomatic management of British sensitivities. Oppenheim was unauthorized, but 28 casualties to cross the Rhine made the unauthorized part hard to argue about with a straight face. Then peacetime, then Bavaria, then a press conference. And this time there was no result waiting in the wings to absorb the mechanism. The war was over. The Third Army was not about to execute a decisive flanking maneuver that would make the press conference, quotes, irrelevant. There was only administration and denazification, and the slow work of occupation governance that Patton was not built for, and knew he was not built for, and said so repeatedly in his diary, and then once in front of journalists. Churchill's line, "He gave them the mechanism. He always gave them the mechanism eventually," is not criticism. It is observation. He is not saying Patton was foolish or reckless or careless. He is saying that the quality that made him irreplaceable in war, the refusal to allow institutional constraint to override his own judgment of what the situation required, was structurally incapable of turning off when the situation changed. Patton could not be Patton selectively. The aggression and the honesty and the speed and the disregard for political consequences were not a strategy he deployed when useful and set aside. When inconvenient, they were what he was. In war, that was the most valuable thing in the Allied command. In peacetime, it was, eventually, untenable. Churchill knew this because Churchill recognized it. He had spent his own career giving the institution mechanisms. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty when Gallipoli happened. He had been loudly and publicly wrong about Indian independence and been kept out of the national government through most of the 1930s, partly as a result. He had come back to power in 1940, because the institution finally ran out of alternatives that were better than him, and he had known, even in his finest hour, that the mechanism would come back around eventually. It had. He had won the war and lost the election in the same summer. He was writing to Randolph from Chartwell, having just learned that Patton was dead, and he was recognizing in Patton's arc something he knew from his own. Patton's wife, Beatrice, flew to Germany immediately after his death. She had been married to him for 35 years. She had followed him through postings on 3 continents. She had managed his correspondence, his social obligations, his relationships with the press, and his periodic disasters with the institution, doing all of this with a competence and discretion that most accounts of Patton's life either underreport or miss entirely. One decision in those days that tells you more about her understanding of her husband than anything she is recorded as having said. She arranged for him to be buried, not in the United States, where every ceremony would have required the machinery of official commemoration, but in Luxembourg, at the American military cemetery at Ham, alongside the soldiers of the Third Army he had commanded. It was her choice. She could have brought him home. She chose not to. He is buried there still. Grave A24 in Plot D alongside 12,00 American soldiers in the country his army liberated in the winter of 1944, when he turned his entire force 90 degrees in a blizzard to relieve Bastogne. When you visit the cemetery, which is outside Luxembourg City on a quiet hillside, you will find his grave at the front of one section, slightly set apart from the rows of his men. The separation was apparently her instruction, close enough to be with them, separate enough that you can find him. When the photographs of the burial reached London, Churchill saw them. He said nothing for the record. Colville noted in his diary that Churchill looked at one photograph for a long time and then set it face down on his desk. It was not grief exactly. Churchill had managed grief in war on a scale that defies ordinary accounting. It was the specific recognition of a thing that was now definitively over. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt asked after the war which Allied commander he considered most dangerous, said Patton. Not Eisenhower, not Montgomery, Patton. Von Rundstedt said that Patton could think faster than his opponent and move faster than his opponent's response. He said that quality existed in one other commander he had encountered in his career, on the German side, and that man had been dead since 1944. Kesselring, who faced Patton in the final weeks of the European campaign, said fighting Patton was like trying to fight the weather. These assessments from the men who were trying to kill him carry a weight that friendly tributes from Allied officers do not. They had incentive to minimize him. They didn't. Churchill's final assessment of Patton, assembled from the letters, the diary notes, Colville's records, and Moran's memoir, is not primarily about the Rhine crossing, or the Harz encirclement, or the sustained advance through Germany. Those events are mentioned, but they are evidence for a larger point Churchill was making, which was about what kind of man produces those events, and what the cost of producing that kind of man is. The cost, Churchill believed, was that the man cannot be maintained, not in peacetime, not in an institution designed for the long continuity of a functioning society, rather than the emergency sprint of an existential war. The institution and the man need each other in one specific window, and then the window closes. And then the institution, which is built for the long run, begins the quiet process of digesting the contribution and releasing the contributor. He wrote to Randolph, "I should like to have known him when the century was younger, and the map was still being drawn. He would have been formidable." He meant before the institution existed in its current form, before staff, colleges, and operational doctrine and supreme headquarters. When a general was his army and an army was its general, and the distance between a decision and its execution was the length of a shouted order. Patton had lived his entire career inside a modern military institution, and had spent that career in constant productive friction with it, producing results of a magnitude that kept him alive inside the institution, past every reasonable expectation that it would release him. The war ended. The results stopped arriving. The institution did what it always does. It filed him under history. The 1970 film starring George C. Scott opened with a monologue in front of an American flag that became one of the most recognizable scenes in American cinema. It was based on a speech Patton actually gave, though the precise version in the film is a composite of several versions from different occasions. Scott won the Academy Award and famously declined it, which Patton, for what it's worth, would almost certainly have found deeply entertaining. The film did what film does, which is to select the most dramatic version of events and compress decades of complexity into scenes that can be understood in 90 seconds. The slapping incident is there. The pearl-handled revolvers are there. The urinating into the Rhine is there. The confrontation with Eisenhower is there. The Czech border is there. What is not quite there is the press conference. The film ends before the end. This is not an accident or an oversight. It is a choice, conscious or not, about which version of the story serves the story we want to tell about Patton. The story we want to tell ends at the height. It ends at the Rhine. It ends with the army sweeping through Germany, and the Germans surrendering in numbers too large to process, and Patton standing at the Czech border, knowing he could be in Prague in 48 hours if only Washington would let him go. The story Churchill was telling, in those letters from Chartwell in the autumn and winter of 1945, ends differently. It ends at Bad Tolz in a press conference room, with a man who had never learned to give the careful answer, saying the honest thing one more time in front of people who were writing it down. Churchill did not think the press conference ending was less true than the Rhine ending. He thought it was more true, not more admirable, more true, because the press conference was the same quality as the Rhine crossing applied to a situation where the same quality produced a different result. The honesty that made Patton say, "We can do this at the riverbank and go across that night with wooden boats and no authorization," was the same. Honesty that made him say, at a press conference, what he actually thought about Nazi Party membership. The institution could absorb the Rhine crossing because the Rhine crossing won the war. The institution could not absorb the press conference because the war was already won. And that, Churchill thought, was the thing worth recording. Not the heroism, which was documented and celebrated and made into film, the mechanism, the specific, structural, human reason why the same quality that produces great men in great emergencies produces, in the absence of emergencies, a press conference. He wrote to Moran in a brief final note on the subject sometime in early 1946, a single line that Moran reproduced in his memoir without comment. Churchill wrote, "Patton was right about everything except the timing. Everything except the timing. The Rhine in March 1945, right moment. The Harz Mountains in April 1945, right moment. Prague in May 1945, right moment that Washington made wrong. The press conference in September 1945, wrong moment for the honest answer. All the same man, all the same instincts, different windows. George S. Patton is buried at Ham, Luxembourg, among the men of the Third Army. Beatrice Patton died in 1953, thrown from a horse at their farm in Massachusetts. She was buried with full military honors at West Point. Their graves are on separate continents, which was her decision, and which she apparently considered the right one. The Third Army crossed the Rhine with 28 casualties on March 23, 1945. The Harz Mountains were encircled, and 45,000 German soldiers surrendered for a cost of 216 American lives. In the final month of the European War, the Third Army advanced more than 200 miles and captured or killed more than 300,000 German soldiers. These are the numbers history kept. The number history tends to skip is the one from September 28, 1945, the number of days between the press conference and the relief of command. 2. Churchill's verdict, assembled from letters and diary notes and private remarks recorded by people who were in the room, amounts to this. The institution was right to relieve him and wrong to need to. Those two things are not contradictory. they are exactly as compatible as they sound, is not very, and also completely, depending on which side of the window you are standing on. The boldest decisions in history never look bold from the inside. They look like a man standing at a cold river in the dark with wooden boats and 28 casualties waiting, and everything he has ever understood about war pressed against everything the institution has ever understood about itself. Patton crossed the river. The institution was still there when he got back. That is the story Churchill thought was worth telling. That is the story that was never quite finished. It is still not finished. The institution, as Churchill noted, always wins. It is also, in every case he could recall, considerably less interesting than the man it tidied away. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. And tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.